Look at this satellite image. A rather unassuming industrial facility nestled in the Hertfordshire countryside, just north of London. Rows of cylindrical storage tanks, some interconnected piping, a few office buildings. It might even look peaceful from above, almost pastoral. Really, sitting there among the green fields of the English home counties. But look closer. Notice something odd, those brownish-orange stains covering entire sections of the facility, the twisted metal structures, the scorched earth patterns radiating outward from certain points. This isn't rust from neglect. This is the corroding aftermath of one of the most powerful non-military explosions in British history. A blast registering 2.4 on the Richter scale, shattering windows 28 miles away, waking up people across London, and creating a fireball visible from space. Amazingly though, when looking at these pictures and understanding what happened here, no one was killed. Not a single fatality. But what is this place? And how did a harmless routine operation turn into Britain's largest peacetime fire? Well, it is the subject of our video today. This is the Buncfield Oil Storage Depot. December 10th, 2005, 7 p.m. Buncfield Oil Depot, Hertfordshire, England. The Friday evening shift was settling in for what everyone expected to be a quiet night. The Buncefield facility, officially operated by Hertfordshire Oil Storage Limited, a joint venture between Total UK and Chevron, was Britain's fifth largest oil depot. Not exactly glamorous work, but critically important. This place supplied roughly 8% of the UK's fuel needs. Every day, over 400 tanker trucks departed these gates, carrying petrol to filling stations across southeast England, diesel to logistics companies, and jet fuel to Heathrow, Gatwick, and Luton airports. Without Buncefield operating smoothly, significant portions of Britain's transportation infrastructure would grind to a halt within days. The depot sprawled across roughly 50 hectares of Hertfordshire countryside, divided into 3 operational zones run by different companies, Total Chevron, BP Shell, and BP independently. The site contained 23 large storage tanks, each capable of holding millions of liters of refined petroleum products. These weren't small containers. Some tanks stood over 12 meters high and 20 meters in diameter. Together, the facility had consent to store up to 194,000 tons of hydrocarbon fuels, though it rarely operated at full capacity. Tank 912 sat in the northern section of the depot, operated by Hertfordshire Oil Storage Limited, under Total UK's day-to-day management. It was a standard above-ground storage tank, with a floating roof, a roof that literally floated on top of the petroleum inside, rising and falling with the liquid level to minimize vapor space and reduce evaporation losses. Tonight Tank 912 was scheduled to receive a delivery of unleaded petrol from the Kingsbury Oil Storage Depot, via the UK oil pipeline network, a vast underground system connecting refineries, depots and distribution centres across Britain. The control room supervisor that evening reviewed the fill schedule. Tank 912 was sitting at relatively low levels after recent distributions. The plan was straightforward. Open the receiving valve, allow petrol to flow in from the pipeline at a controlled rate, monitor the level gauges as the tank filled, and close the valve when approaching capacity. Simple, routine, done hundreds of times before. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where that harmless decision would soon prove catastrophic. Tank 912 had been problematic for months. Its automatic tank gauge, the instrument that told operators in the control room exactly how much fuel was in the tank, had been malfunctioning since at least August 2005. The gauge used a servo-operated displacer system, essentially, a float mechanism that moved up and down with the liquid level, transmitting that position electronically to the control room displays. When working properly, operators could see real-time fill levels displayed on their computer screens, along with automated alarms warning them as the tank approached capacity. The problem? Tank 912's gauge frequently froze. The servo motor would stick. The display would stop updating. Operators would see the gauge reading sitting at say 2.5 meters of fuel depth, and it would just stay there, unchanging, even as thousands of liters continued pouring into the tank. Then mysteriously, hours later, the gauge would suddenly unfreeze and jump to the actual level, or sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes it just stayed frozen until someone manually reset it. This had happened so many times that the operating staff had become desensitized to the problem. "Oh, tank 912's gauge is stuck again." It was almost a running joke. When the gauge froze during filling operations, operators developed workarounds. They'd calculate expected fill times based on flow rates. They'd send someone out to physically check the sight gauge on the tank itself, a old-fashioned manual indicator on the outside of the tank. They'd rely on the independent high-level switch, a separate safety system specifically designed to automatically shut off inflow if the tank overfilled. Here's a question for you. If you were working in that control room and a tank gauge that frequently malfunctioned showed a frozen reading, would you immediately shut down the fill? Or would you think, "It's probably stuck again," like it always does, and continue monitoring using other methods? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The gauge had been serviced back in August 2005. Technicians had examined it, performed maintenance, and declared it fit for service. But the freezing problem persisted. No one seemed to understand why, and critically, no one made the decision to take tank 912 out of service until the gauge problem was definitively resolved. Production pressures perhaps, the need to maintain storage capacity, the inconvenience of losing a major tank. Whatever the reasons, tank 912 remained in active use with a gauge everyone knew was unreliable. Now about that independent high-level switch, the backup safety system. This was a separate device, completely independent from the main tank gauge, installed specifically as a fail-safe. If the main gauge failed, if operators weren't paying attention, if something went wrong, the independent high-level switch would catch it. When the fuel level reached a predetermined height near the tank's maximum safe capacity, the switch would automatically trigger, closing valves and stopping the inflow. It was a simple, robust mechanical system, a paddle-type switch submerged in the fuel. When the rising liquid level lifted the paddle to a certain angle, it completed an electrical circuit that shut off the supply pumps and closed the inlet valves. Except, the independent high-level switch on tank 912 wasn't working either, and the operators didn't know it. Here's how this safety system was designed. The switch mechanism had a test lever with 3 positions: up, middle and down. During normal operation, the lever sat in the middle position. To test the system, an operator would manually push the lever upward, simulating a high-level condition. This should trigger an alarm in the control room and activate the automatic shutdown sequence. If everything worked properly, you'd hear the alarm, see warning lights, and watch the inlet valves close. Test successful. To prevent the test lever from accidentally moving to the down position during normal operations, which would disable the safety function, the system came with a simple padlock. When the lever was in the middle, normal operation position, you'd secure it there with the padlock, ensuring it couldn't slip downward and deactivate the switch. The problem was human nature and procedure drift. Operators needed to test this safety system regularly, monthly or quarterly, depending on the schedule. To perform the test, they had to remove the padlock, push the lever up, verify the alarm, and then return the lever to the middle position and replace the padlock. Simple, right? But somewhere along the line, perhaps during a routine test weeks or months earlier, perhaps during maintenance, perhaps during the August 2005 gauge servicing, someone removed the padlock to test the system and forgot to put it back on. Without that padlock securing the lever, it could move freely. And apparently at some point, the lever had gradually worked its way down into the low position, either through vibration, through accidental contact during maintenance, or simply through gravity and mechanical play. In the low position, the switch was effectively disabled. The paddle could rise as high as it wanted, the fuel could fill to the very brim of the tank, and the switch would never trigger. No alarm would sound. No automatic shutdown would occur. The safety system was inoperative, and nobody knew. Think about that for a moment. The main level gauge was unreliable and frequently froze. The independent backup safety switch was accidentally disabled. Tank 912 was about to be filled essentially blind, with operators relying on manual calculations and the assumption that something would warn them if things went wrong. The fill operation began at approximately 7 p.m. Petrol flowed into tank 912 from the Kingsbury pipeline at a rate of roughly 550 cubic meters per hour, about 9,200 liters per minute. That's fast. Very fast. It's like filling a swimming pool through a fire hose. The tank's capacity was approximately 3,200 cubic meters, so a complete fill from empty would take about 6 hours. But tank 912 wasn't empty. It started the fill with around 1,000 cubic meters already inside, roughly 1/3 full. That meant this particular fill would take maybe 4 hours to reach safe capacity. The control room staff knew this. They had the flow rate data. They understood the tank's starting level. Everything was planned. For the first few hours, everything proceeded normally. The tank gauge display showed the fuel level rising steadily. 1.5 meters, 2.0 meters, 2.5 meters. The operators periodically checked the screen, verifying that the level was increasing as expected, based on the known flow rate. No problems, no anomalies. But here's the critical detail. The control room wasn't dedicated solely to monitoring tank 912. The operators were managing multiple operations simultaneously, other tanks being filled or emptied, distribution loading racks where trucks were being filled, pipeline pressure monitoring, safety system checks. The computer screens displayed information on dozens of tanks and processes. Tank 912's fill was one operation among many. The control room software used a windowed interface. Each tank being monitored had its own window displaying its gauge reading, alarms, and status. But with so many operations happening, not all windows could be visible simultaneously. The screens weren't large enough, so operators had to actively click between windows to check on different tanks. It wasn't continuous real-time monitoring, it was periodic checking. Click on tank 912's window, verify the level looks reasonable, click away to check something else, come back 15 minutes later to check tank 912 again. This design created a vulnerability. If an operator didn't actively select tank 912's window and look at it, they wouldn't see the gauge reading or any alarms associated with that tank. There was no persistent, always visible dashboard showing the status of all critical operations at a glance. Around 11 p.m., the evening shift prepared to hand over to the night shift. The outgoing supervisor briefed the incoming supervisor on active operations. Tank 912 is receiving petrol from Kingsbury. Started at 7 p.m., should be completing fill around midnight or a bit after. Keep an eye on it. The gauge has been a bit temperamental lately. You know how 912 is, but it's been tracking okay so far. Everything else is normal. The night shift supervisor acknowledged. Tank 912's fill would be one of his primary monitoring tasks for the next few hours. Midnight came and went. Tank 912 continued filling. The night shift supervisor periodically checked the gauge display. 3.0 meters, 3.2 meters, 3.5 meters, still rising steadily. Flow rate remained constant at roughly 550 cubic meters per hour. Based on the starting level and elapsed time, the tank should be approaching 70 to 80% capacity. On schedule. No issues. But here's what was actually happening inside tank 912, invisible to everyone in the control room. The floating roof was rising normally as the fuel level increased. The tank's cylindrical wall extended upward to a total height of about 12 meters. The maximum safe fill level, the highest the fuel should ever reach, was marked at approximately 11.5 meters, leaving a small safety margin below the absolute top of the tank. At that level the tank would contain its full working capacity of roughly 3,200 cubic meters. As the fuel level passed 9 meters, then 10 meters, the tank was filling into its upper regions, the zone where the independent high-level switch should have been preparing to trigger. The paddle was rising with the fuel surface, being lifted by the buoyant force of millions of liters of petrol. But remember, the switch lever was in the down position, disabled. The paddle could rise all it wanted. Nothing would happen. No electrical circuit would close. No alarm would sound. No shutdown would activate. At approximately 3:05 a.m., Tank 912's automatic tank gauge froze. The display in the control room stopped updating. The level reading, somewhere around 9.5 to 10 meters, about 80% full, just sat there, static, unchanging. The fuel kept flowing, 550 cubic meters per hour, every hour, 9,000 liters every minute, but the gauge showed no change. Now here's the tragedy. If that gauge had been working correctly, it would have triggered a series of automated alarms as the tank filled. User high alarm, a customizable warning level set by supervisors, typically at 80 to 85% capacity, meaning pay attention, intervention may be needed soon. High-level alarm, a fixed alarm set at approximately 90% capacity, meaning you're getting close to maximum safe fill, prepare to stop inflow. High-level alarm, a critical alarm, set at about 95% capacity, the last warning before the independent high-level switch, should trigger automatic shutdown at 98% capacity. These weren't just visual warnings on the screen. They were designed to be audible alarms, loud, attention-demanding sounds in the control room that operators couldn't ignore. Beeping, buzzing, whatever. The point was, you will notice this. But if the gauge is frozen, if it's stuck showing 9.5 meters, when the actual level is climbing past 10 meters, past 10.5 meters, approaching 11 meters, no alarms. The software doesn't know the tank is filling beyond what the gauge is reporting. The alarm thresholds are based on the gauge reading, and the gauge reading isn't changing. The operators had been trained to respond to audible alarms. When you hear the alarm, you investigate immediately. You check the tank. You verify the situation. You take action. But if there's no alarm, if everything appears normal on the screen, if Tank 912's window shows a level reading that, while frozen, isn't yet in the alarm range, why would you suspect a problem? The night shift supervisor did eventually notice that Tank 912's gauge reading hadn't changed in a while. He clicked on the tank's window around 4 a.m. and saw the same 9.5 meter reading that had. Gauge is stuck again, he muttered. Classic Tank 912 behavior. He pulled out his calculator. Let's see. Started filling at 7 p.m. with about 1,000 cubic meters inside. Flow rate of 550 cubic meters per hour. It's now 4 a.m. That's 9 hours of filling. 9 hours times 550 is roughly 4,950 cubic meters added. Starting amount plus added amount equals, wait, that can't be right. That's more than the tank's total capacity. He rechecked his math. Maybe the starting level wasn't 1,000 cubic meters, maybe it was lower, or maybe the flow rate wasn't quite 550. He made a mental note to send someone out at daylight to physically check the sight gauge on the tank itself. Manual verification, old school method. But it was still dark outside. Cold December night. The site was quiet except for the constant hum of pumps and the low rumble of fuel flowing through underground pipelines. He had other tasks demanding attention. He checked Tank 912 properly when dawn came in a couple hours. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known without walking out to the tank in the darkness with a flashlight, was that Tank 912 had already passed its maximum safe fill level. Inside Tank 912 the fuel level reached the absolute top of the floating roof. There was nowhere left for the roof to rise. The petrol had filled the tank to its physical limit, but the fuel kept coming. 550 cubic meters per hour, 9,200 liters per minute, 153 liters per second. When a tank with a floating roof overfills, the excess fuel has to go somewhere. It doesn't just stop. Physics doesn't allow that. The fuel finds the path of least resistance, and in this case, That path was up and over the top edge of the tank wall, around the rim where the floating roof met the shell. At 5:37 a.m., unleaded petrol began cascading over the top of tank 912, pouring down the outside of the tank like a spillway on a dam. This wasn't a trickle. This was 153 liters every single second gushing over the rim. The tank sat inside a bund wall, a containment barrier designed to catch any spillage and prevent environmental contamination. These bund walls surrounded each tank like a concrete moat, capable of holding the entire contents of the tank if it ever ruptured. So as petrol overflowed tank 912, it poured down into the bund area, beginning to fill that secondary containment space. But here's the critical point. Petrol isn't just a liquid, it's a volatile liquid. It evaporates readily, especially when exposed to air and surface area. As thousands of liters of petrol splashed onto the concrete floor of the bund, exposed to December air, it began evaporating rapidly. Vapor rose from the growing pool of fuel, invisible at first, but dense with hydrocarbon molecules. Petrol vapor is heavier than air. It doesn't rise and disperse like steam, it sinks, it pools. It flows like water, downhill into low spots, filling depressions and spreading outward along the ground. The bund area around tank 912 was lower than the surrounding ground, intentionally designed that way to contain spills. This meant the vapor had nowhere to go. It accumulated in the bund, growing thicker and denser with each passing second as more petrol overflowed and evaporated. Within 10 minutes, roughly 90,000 liters of petrol had overflowed the tank, about 90 cubic meters, or enough to fill a residential swimming pool. Of that, perhaps 20 to 30% had already evaporated, creating several tons of hydrocarbon vapor filling the bund area, and beginning to spill over the bund walls themselves. By 5:50 a.m., the vapor cloud was visible, not the vapor itself. Hydrocarbon vapor is colorless, but its effects. The vapor cloud was so dense, it was causing optical distortion, like heat shimmer on a hot road. More tellingly, moisture in the cold morning air was condensing on contact with the cold vapor, creating white mist that people could actually see. The December morning was unnaturally still. No wind, no breeze. Perfect conditions for a ground-level vapor cloud to spread horizontally, rather than dispersing upward. The cloud crept across the depot grounds like a living thing, flowing around obstacles, seeking low paths, growing wider and thicker. By 6 a.m., the vapor cloud extended roughly 360 meters in diameter, nearly 4 football fields across, centered on tank 912. Conservative estimates suggest the cloud contained 8 to 10 tons of petrol vapor mixed with air in concentrations well within the explosive range. Let me explain what explosive range means. Hydrocarbon vapors only explode when mixed with air in specific proportions. Too little vapor, too lean, and there's not enough fuel to sustain combustion. Too much vapor, too rich, and there's not enough oxygen. The explosive range for petrol vapor in air is roughly 1.4% to 7.6% by volume, a sweet spot where the mixture can ignite and propagate a flame front at supersonic speeds, creating an explosion rather than just burning. The vapor cloud around tank 912, at 6 a.m., was well within this range across most of its volume. It was essentially a 360-meter wide bomb, waiting for a spark. People saw it. Workers arriving for the early morning shift noticed the white mist hanging over the northern section of the depot. Truck drivers waiting at the loading racks pointed it out to each other. "What's that cloud over by the tanks?" Some described it as fog, though it seemed odd to have fog in just one area of the site on an otherwise clear morning. One driver, sitting in his cab waiting for his tank to be filled, remembered thinking it looked strange. He'd been coming to Buncfield for years, and he'd never seen anything quite like that persistent white cloud hovering at ground level. He made a mental note to ask someone about it, then went back to checking his delivery paperwork. Inside the control room, The night shift supervisor still hadn't received any alarms from tank 912. The gauge still showed 9.5 meters. The independent high-level switch remained silent. As far as the instruments were concerned, nothing was wrong. At approximately 6 a.m., a site fire alarm activated, not from tank 912, but from a separate fire detection system that had sensed abnormal conditions in the northern tank farm area. This alarm did trigger an audible warning in the control room, and automatically started the site's firefighting water pumps. The supervisor heard the alarm, saw which zone it was coming from, and reached for the radio to call the roving security patrol to investigate. Before he could transmit at 6:01 a.m., one of the firefighting pumps started up. That pump, designed to save lives, designed to protect property, designed as a safety system, generated a small electrical spark inside its motor housing as it energized. Just a tiny arc of electricity, the kind of spark that occurs thousands of times a day in electrical equipment all over the world, normally completely harmless. But this spark occurred inside a pump house that the vapor cloud had infiltrated. The heavy hydrocarbon vapor, flowing downward and spreading outward, had found ventilation openings, had seeped into below-grade electrical rooms, had filled low-lying spaces throughout the northern depot area. That single spark found vapor in explosive concentration. The vapor ignited, and the world exploded. The explosion wasn't a single event. It was a cascading sequence of detonations as the massive vapor cloud ignited in sections, each ignition triggering the next in a domino effect of destruction. The initial blast originated at the pump house where the spark occurred. The confined vapor inside the building detonated first, a sharp violent explosion but that was just the primer. The real devastation came in the next microseconds as the flame front propagated outward through the 360-meter vapor cloud at supersonic speed. Witnesses described a wall of flame that appeared to move across the depot grounds, faster than thought, because it was. A deflagration to detonation transition occurred as the flame accelerated through optimal fuel-air mixture. The blast wave preceded the visible fire, traveling at roughly 2,000 meters per second, 6 times the speed of sound. The overpressure was immense, 0.5 to 1.0 bars, enough to collapse buildings and turn windows into shrapnel. Tank 912 ruptured completely. The floating roof, weighing several tons, was thrown over 100 meters away. The tank shell peeled open like twisted metal origami. The remaining 2,500 cubic meters of petrol instantly ignited. A fireball erupted. Not a Hollywood effect, but a sustained inferno. Flames reached 50 to 70 meters high, taller than a 20-story building. The thermal radiation ignited nearby tanks. Tank 910 caught fire. Then tank 911. The fire was spreading. The blast hit the control room like a punch. Windows exploded inward. The building shook violently. The night supervisor was thrown backward against the far wall. Miraculously, he survived with cuts, bruises and a concussion. Every alarm activated simultaneously, an overwhelming cacophony about a disaster that had already happened. Outside was apocalyptic. The entire northern section engulfed in flames. 23 tanks sat in the fire's path. If they began exploding sequentially, devastation could reach residential areas. Here's the first miracle. Despite the massive explosion at 6:01 a.m. on a Sunday morning, only 43 people were injured. None fatally. An explosion equivalent to 32 tons of TNT, Britain's largest peacetime fire, and nobody died. How? Timing and luck. Most workers were in southern buildings, shielded by distance. Truck drivers were in the southeastern section, away from the blast. The few near northern tanks had seen the vapor cloud, smelled petrol, and begun walking away before the explosion. Their instincts saved them. One security guard heard a sound like a jet engine seconds before the blast. He dove behind concrete. The blast wave deafened him temporarily, but left him otherwise unharmed. Emergency services received the first call at 6:02 a.m. Buncfield is on fire. Everything is on fire. Fire crews from multiple counties responded to a scenario beyond their worst planning. The heat was too intense to approach. Damaged tanks still contained millions of liters of fuel, constant risk of additional explosions. The incident commander made a crucial decision: establish a perimeter, evacuate surrounding areas, let the fire burn controlled while preventing spread to unignited tanks. Firefighters deployed master streams to cool adjacent tanks and prevent bleave. Boiling liquid expanding vapor explosions that could launch tank fragments like missiles. The battle lasted 5 days. Smoke visible from space. London's air quality sensors detected elevated hydrocarbons. Residents 10 miles away reported ash falling like black snow. The smoke plume extended over 100 miles. On December 13th, the main fire was extinguished. That evening Tank 910 reignited. The decision let it burn out rather than risk personnel. It burned 2 more days. The explosion damaged 425 homes. Over 2,000 people evacuated. Windows shattered up to 5 miles away. The Northgate Business Park was devastated. An Argos warehouse lost its roof. 4 to 5 million pounds of Christmas inventory destroyed. Multiple businesses couldn't access premises for weeks. No income. Bills still due. Insurance claims taking months. Environmental damage was extensive. Bund walls cracked under extreme heat. Contaminated firefighting water leaked into groundwater. Soil contamination detected 50 meters beyond boundaries. Cleanup continued for years. The economic impact was massive. Buncefield supplied 8% of UK fuel, suddenly gone. Panic buying ensued. Queues at petrol stations created localized shortages. Aviation hit hardest. Heathrow, Gatwick, Luton relied on Buncefield for jet fuel. Long-haul flights added European refueling stops, adding hours and thousands in costs. Lawsuits, 2,700 claims totaling over £1 billion. The High Court ruled companies liable for approximately £700 million. Criminal charges came swiftly. 5 companies prosecuted. 2010 guilty verdicts with fines from £1,000 to £6, 20 pence million. Many felt inadequate, given the negligence. So what caused this? Tank 912 overflowed because both gauge and backup switch failed simultaneously. But calling them failures is generous. These were foreseeable problems everyone ignored. Tank 912's gauge malfunctioned since August 2005, 4 months before. The servo motor stuck repeatedly. Technicians noted it, sometimes sticks, declared it operational. The problem continued. It became a joke. Tank 912's gauge acting up again. Why keep using it? Production pressure. Taking tanks offline affects revenue. The attitude, it usually works, and we have the backup switch. Except they didn't. Because of the padlock. The independent switch was functional. The failure was purely human. The switch had 3 positions: up test, middle active, down disabled. A padlock secured it in middle to prevent accidental disabling. Someone forgot to replace the padlock after testing. The lever gradually worked down to disabled. Days, weeks, maybe months. The switch was tested regularly, but tests only checked if pushing you up triggered an alarm. Nobody verified the padlock was installed. Box-ticking compliance, not safety thinking. Worse, operators weren't trained that down position disabled everything. The night supervisor saw 9.5 meters frozen. Gauge stuck again. Made a note to check at dawn. Had other tasks. Would deal with it later. The alarm system triggered based on gauge readings. Gauge showed 9.5 while actual level climbed past 11. Software had no idea. Underlying everything, production over safety. Equipment issues poorly documented. Near misses ignored. Tank 912 had nearly overflowed before operators caught it just in time. But no investigation. Just deal with it and move on. Normalization of deviance. First freeze caused concern. 10th time. Routine. Each successful workaround reinforced it was acceptable. What makes Buncfield instructive? How ordinary it was. No sabotage. Just a stuck gauge, forgotten padlock, and decisions that seemed reasonable but collectively created catastrophe. The Swiss cheese model: usually safety layers don't align. But occasionally all holes line up. Gauge fails when backup disabled, when operators distracted. Disaster. Buncfield led to sweeping changes, redundant systems, independent audits, stricter testing, enhanced training. Most importantly, cultural shift. Usually works gauges. Unacceptable. Production pressure over safety. Unacceptable. The question: how many Tank 912s exist right now? Equipment with known problems everyone works around. Organizations where production pressure silences concerns. Buncfield's lesson: disasters are frequently predictable if we see warnings and act. A forgotten padlock. A problematic gauge. Britain's largest peacetime fire. Sometimes the difference is that small. This wasn't sabotage. It was just Tuesday. Small problems worked around until they aligned at 6:01 a.m. December 11, 2005. Before you go, think about this. Right now there's probably a Tank 912 near you. A chemical plant with a sensor that acts up sometimes. A gas station pump you just have to jiggle. Maybe your workplace has equipment everyone knows is broken but keeps using because stopping would be inconvenient. Here's my final question. If you were that night shift supervisor and saw Tank 912's gauge frozen for the third time that month, would you have shut down the fill immediately? Or done exactly what he did? Assumed it was just another glitch? Be honest in the comments. Because the scary part is, most of us would have done the same thing. If these stories fascinate you, don't forget to subscribe. We examine industrial disasters and everything frozen in history in detail. Each of you is valuable to us. Thank you for watching.